Here is a story that spans 7 years. From what started as a fairy tale, 6 trips to Italy, a wedding in Rome, and finally bringing my husband to North America. What I didn't know is that he was living a double life, hiding the number of children he had, and a web of lies, deceit, betrayal, and deception. This is my story, and sharing it is part of my healing journey. Here I was in October 2018 on my way to Italy. This was our first time meeting in person, and after months of talking, planning, and building what I believed was a shared future. What I believed then was that he was single. What I believed then was that he was honest. These moments were real. The laughter, the closeness, the intention. What I didn't know is that years later, I would learn that during this very trip, he was still living with another woman who was actually pregnant at the time. I didn't know that then, but this post is about what I believed, not what I later discovered. By December 2018, I was back in Italy for my second trip. I stayed until the early part of January. By then, he had told me that he moved out and was living with a friend in Napoli. This visit felt like progress. We were building something slowly and intentionally. At the time, I believed that he only had one child, and I was told that he wasn't in contact with the child's mother and didn't even know where the child or the mother was. That was the information I had. That's what he told me. I didn't know and wouldn't learn until 2025 that within a week of me leaving Italy, that same woman, pregnant at the time, was coming to his apartment. So this is where we are in the story. By the end of 2018, I had already been to Italy twice. I believed he had moved out and was living with a friend in Napoli. I believed there was only one child. I was told there was no contact with the child's mother and that he didn't know where she was or where the child was. At that point, I had also begun helping him financially in small, practical ways because I believed we were building toward a shared future. When I left Italy after my second trip, that was the truth I understood. What I didn't know then, and what I would not learn until years later, was that within a week of me leaving Italy, the pregnant woman, the mother of his first child, had been invited into the apartment for a visit, the apartment that I was helping to pay for. I didn't know that. I didn't know any of that at the time because I thought they were in no contact. And every decision I made was based solely on the information I had. By the time I made my third trip to Italy in May of 2019, I wasn't questioning the relationship at all. I was pouring into it. I wanted us to have shared experiences, not just routine. I wanted him to see a different side of Italy, beyond survival, beyond the day-to-day. We traveled, we explored, we experienced places together. And at that time, my focus wasn't on doubt, it was on growth. I was showing up with openness, generosity, and the belief that we were building something real. After returning home from my third trip to Italy, our relationship continued to move forward. We stayed in close contact, talking every single day, multiple times a day. By that point, it had been over a year since he had first given me a ring and asked me to marry him. With that time passed, I made the decision to move forward with the K-1 visa process. At this point in time, I was still under the impression that he had no contact with the child's mother and no contact with the child. I truly believed he did not know where they were. What I did not know in 2019 was that a second son was born, and it was his. I had no knowledge of this child's existence at the time. I would only learn about him years later after he had already come to the United States. By December 2019, I went back to Italy again for the fourth time. And this time, we drove across borders together, through Paris, through Monaco, and then back to Italy. It felt like a real partnership. We were traveling, making plans, and sharing experiences. I was making sacrifices. I was sharing my time, my energy, and my resources openly. There was nothing hidden on my side. I was transparent about my life, my intentions, and what I was building toward, what I thought we were building toward together. I truly believed that same transparency existed on her side as well. At the time, I truly believed we were moving forward with the same understanding. What I didn't know then, and something I would only learn years later, was that his youngest son had already been born in Italy and was around 6 months old. I was still under the impression that he had no contact with the first child that I knew about and no contact with the child's mother. I wonder, did I miss the red flags? I thought we were building together, but I couldn't have been farther from the truth. We started our 2020 together in Paris, Nice, and Monaco. And like most people around New Year's, I was thinking about what came next, not just for us, but for our future. There was already a lot happening, as just before leaving for this fourth trip to Italy, my daughter had been diagnosed with epilepsy. It was a stressful time as I had been juggling my regular motherhood duties while trying to process the reality of her diagnosis. Navigating doctor appointments, juggling responsibilities, and the weight that comes with being a mother first. What made it even possible for me to keep going was the support of my family and the fact that my children's father was very actively involved in their lives. We shared custody of our children, although they were primarily with me. But over the years, we had established a fairly balanced co-parenting relationship. I was also working and maintaining my career, which at the time involved a very busy travel schedule while juggling everything else. Because of the support I was blessed with having in my life for myself and my children, I had the ability to redirect my time, my energy, and my resources. This is what had allowed me to believe that doing so was a worthy investment in a future with my soon-to-be husband. His situation in Italy was pretty unstable, but because I thought we were building a life together, I truly believed that helping him to stabilize himself as a man would be a help, not a hindrance. That belief shaped my decisions, as well as my belief in him as the man in my life. For some reason, I believed that he truly cared about me and our future together. We had goals, we had hopes, and we had dreams. All I wanted was the best for him because he was the man I loved. I thought he wanted the same for me and for us, but I was wrong. I didn't see it as a sacrifice at the time. I saw it as part of my commitment to us. And in that moment, I thought we were moving forward as a couple and as partners. But now I realize that while I was moving forward with honesty, he was moving forward with deception. While I was thinking about him and us, he was thinking about him. After I returned home from my fourth trip, this became the start of a long stretch between visits. Within a week of my return home, my daughter had her first full body seizure. When it happened, I was traveling for work, reviewing patient charts at a medical center while my family was caring for my daughter. I thank God that my mother is a retired registered nurse because she became my rock during these early emergencies with my daughter. In the month that followed, my daughter experienced several more seizures before we were able to stabilize her through medication. We were literally learning in real time. My children's father became more physically present so he could help when I had to travel for work. It was practical, it was transparent, and it was about co-parenting, nothing else. At the same time, the world began to shut down. COVID hit, and Italy was one of the first places deeply affected. Borders closed, travel stopped, and our immigration process froze. When Nigeria was added to the list of banned countries, the K-1 visa path we had initiated became impossible to move forward. And through all of this, I continued to work and support the man I love. The situation in Italy was unstable, and I wanted to see him win. I communicated openly and did my best to reassure him. I explained my reality honestly, even as I noticed he expressed discomfort about my children's father being around. I told him he had nothing to worry about, and at the same time, I didn't think I had anything to worry about either. By this point, we were in early spring of 2020, and COVID continued to spread. I had already retained a lawyer and started the K-1 process, so we were officially engaged now, and I was going to do everything possible for my fiancé, my husband-to-be. Unfortunately, at the time, immigration wasn't just delayed, it was frozen. Trump had added Nigerians to the list of banned countries, and though he was in Italy, his newly obtained passport was from Nigeria, which meant our K-1 visa process could not move forward. So we adapted. When one plan collapsed, we began exploring another. That's when the idea of a destination wedding came into focus, and we decided on Malta. Since I had been married before to the father of my children, I had already been through a big, lavish ceremony with over 350 of our closest family and friends, so I had no intentions or desire to do that again. And since I'd be the one footing the bill this time, it needed to be simple and affordable, but still beautiful. So I found a wedding planner and we began to discuss logistics, timelines, and requirements. Planning began to move forward and deposits were made. Meanwhile, the world continued to shut down and travel remained uncertain. Borders stayed closed, flights were canceled, and timelines dissolved. We had to cancel our plans for our wedding in Malta. Fortunately, I was able to get back some of the deposits, but the planning for a wedding stopped. We were both disappointed, but at the time, we understood this as resilience. What couples do when circumstances make the original plan impossible. So we kept the faith and waited, and waited, and waited. We waited, and waited, and waited. And then, in the summer of 2020, the moment we had been waiting for finally arrived. As travel restrictions began to ease, Italy started allowing entry again, including for Canadian citizens. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't simple, but it was enough to finally move. Once it became clear that travel was possible again, I bought my ticket for August. This wasn't spontaneous, it was planned, because at this point we had already began preparing seriously for marriage. I hired a wedding planner in Italy who would help us organize the ceremony and handle the logistics for a wedding in Rome. There were specific things that needed to happen before I even arrived. We needed our free-to-marry certificates. His had to come from Nigeria, and mine had to come from Canada. While that process was underway, I was preparing on my end as well. I went wedding dress shopping with my mom, my sister, and my daughter, knowing I needed to have a dress before I even stepped foot in Italy. By that point, after months of stress and lockdowns, I had gained quite a bit of weight. I didn't feel at my physical best, but I made it work anyway. At the same time, he too was preparing in his own way, and we were both getting ready to see each other again, not casually, but with intention. During this period, I continued supporting him as best as I could. Alongside caring for my children and managing my own financial responsibilities, I helped him to stay stable with food, rent, and staying connected. I believed we were building something real. So when the door finally opened even slightly, I stepped through it, and I was back in my happy place while we prepared for our wedding in Rome. When I finally arrived back in Italy for my 5th trip, I was back in my happy place. After months of waiting in uncertainty and closed borders, here we were finally together again. This trip wasn't about daydreaming anymore. It was about preparing for our nuptials. I had booked my stay for a full month because we didn't even have an exact wedding date yet. The plan was to handle the legalities once I arrived and allow our wedding planner to secure a date for us in Rome. We were working through requirements, the free to marry certificates, the nulla osta, his from Nigeria, mine from Canada. And while all of that was happening, life was still life. We were staying in a cute little Airbnb where we could cook together, and since I would be still working remotely while I was there was an adequate office space and Wi-Fi for me to do so seamlessly across time zones. In between, we did what couples do. We ate out, we explored, we spent quality time together, we cooked, and back then he would be such a sweetheart and go to the market to get groceries while I worked. I'd give him a list and he'd come back with everything I asked for. It was calm, it was hopeful. It felt like a real prelude to married life. And I felt like we were finally moving forward. There was a lot to do, but we had it covered. Though some things about that time only made sense years later, in that moment I felt joy. Not everything is always visible in real time, and clarity didn't come then, it came later. But in that moment, I was a blissful bride-to-be, enjoying time with my darling husband-to-be, in my happy place, Italy. In moments like this, moments of bliss, it's hard to imagine that the person you love so dearly, so purely, so passionately, could be deceiving you in real time. The idea feels unthinkable, unfathomable. Nonetheless, for a long time, one of the closest friends of my soon-to-be husband was the friend that he was currently living with. This was the friend I had met on my first trip, the one who had encouraged him to move in and then showed him the ropes in Napoli. They shared daily life, conversations, and history. He was also someone I had come to know well during my visits to Italy. He would often pop on the phone to say hi when I was on video calls with my hubby-to-be. But as our wedding plans moved forward, I noticed a silence from him, and I could see that their dynamic had begun to change. There was tension, distance, and I couldn't quite place why. At the time, I believed it had to do with the wedding. We hadn't included him in the ceremony, not because he wasn't important, but because of logistics and cost. It would mean paying for travel, accommodation, and food for yet another person, and that simply wasn't in my budget. So when I sensed that things were a bit rocky between them, I assumed that was the reason, and I left it there. I didn't push, I didn't question, because I had no reason to. I just thought we were all adjusting as life was changing. What I didn't realize was that this shift in dynamics mattered, and it went much deeper than I would realize until many years later. But in this moment, I was simply a bride-to-be, happily counting down the days to our wedding. I trusted that everything else would settle itself. Most people look at their wedding photos and feel joy and happiness. When I look at mine now, I feel pain and sadness. Not because the day wasn't beautiful. It was. Not because I wasn't in love. I was. I was in love deeply. But it's because I have uncovered how much was already unfolding beneath that day. As I prepared to walk down the aisle, I was a woman acting in complete good faith. I believed in the vows I was about to speak. I believed in the life I was choosing. I believed I was stepping into a marriage built on honesty and mutual commitment. What I didn't know then was that plans were already forming that did not include me in the way a marriage should. I didn't know that decisions were already being shaped that would eventually tear us apart. I didn't know what would come after: his resentment, his abandonment, his emotional cruelty, the multiple trips he would make right back here to Italy without me, and the way I would be treated once he arrived in North America. None of that was visible this day, and that is where my grief lives. Grief isn't only about death. Sometimes the deepest grief comes when the person is still alive and the truth finally arrives. I'm grieving the woman I was in these photos, the bride who loved honestly, the bride who committed fully, the bride who had no idea what she would later endure. Healing doesn't happen through silence. Healing happens when grief is witnessed.
When there are many different versions of the truth, which one do you believe? As I reflect on my wedding day, this is the question I now ask myself. Here I was in Italy, my happy place, making the decision to marry a man I loved deeply, a man I had cared for and supported throughout his circumstances for years. I had been married before, but I had never married a man in survival. At the time, I didn't even fully understand what that meant or how much it would shape the marriage I was entering. I believed love was enough. I believed that commitment could transcend circumstance, but I know better now. Let's be clear about something. I did not choose this marriage out of need. I could have chosen a man who was already stable, like my previous husband and father of my children. I could have chosen a man who could take care of me the way a husband is meant to. I could have chosen a partnership where I was not the provider, the stabilizer, or the one carrying the weight. I had options. I always have. I was not searching before I met him. I was not lacking. I was here because I chose him. I chose him freely. I chose him deliberately. I chose him out of love, believing that we were building something together. What I couldn't imagine then was that he never truly intended to be a husband to me in the way I would be a wife to him. I could never imagine that no matter how much I gave and no matter how much I supported or sacrificed, it would never be enough. Because once he was legitimized in North America, he was already looking for a way out. I was marrying him out of love, openly, honestly, and despite his circumstances. But what I couldn't see then was that he was marrying me while carrying truths that he had deliberately withheld. Love does not require deception. A man who is choosing you freely does not need to mask his life. And yet, so much of what he brought into our marriage was veiled in deception. At the time of our marriage, I didn't know that there was a child I had never been told about. I didn't know that an entire pregnancy had been hidden from me throughout our relationship. I didn't know that there was ongoing communication, connection, and coordination with the mother of his children that I had never been made aware of. I didn't know that while I was planning a life, he was managing multiple realities. And yet, there I was, walking toward him, saying vows. Standing there, I never imagined that the love, respect, and admiration we shared could one day harden into cruelty. I could not have imagined that tenderness would turn into resentment, respect would turn into mockery and public humiliation. I could not have imagined that the man I was marrying would later arrive in North America not to build the life we had planned, but to seek out women who could fund a life he no longer intended to build with me. I could never have imagined that the pain he would cause me could fracture my life so completely that I would no longer recognize myself, that everything I had built would crumble into something I would have to rebuild from the ground up. I could never have imagined that the same man I stood beside in devotion would one day speak to me with contempt, comparing me to women who had not given, sacrificed, or endured even a fraction of what I had. To imagine that love would be replaced not just with indifference, but with cruelty, with disrespect, with mockery, and with public insult. Most people look at their wedding day with joy and nostalgia. I look at mine now through grief. Not because the day wasn't beautiful, it was, but because I now understand what I was standing inside of without full knowledge and without full consent. I share this inside my grief because grief is not only about death. Grief is also about discovering that the life you thought you were building was never what it appeared to be. Grief is what happens when the person is still alive, but the truth finally arrives. I grieve the woman I was that day, the bride who believed she was choosing partnership and love. I grieve the version of love that assumed honesty as a given. I share my story not for pity, not for spectacle, but because grief deserves witnessing. Healing happens when truth is spoken aloud. So if you're watching this, thank you for holding space as I tell it. Because when there are many versions of the truth, only one truth can withstand time. And this is my truth. After the ceremony, we went to dinner, and I remember being very intentional about that moment. I wanted the day to feel warm, thoughtful, and meaningful. Not extravagant, but full of care. I was never trying to buy a man. I don't need to do that. I grew up watching real marriage. My parents have been married for over 55 years. I watched partnership in motion, consistency, two people showing up for each other, not one carrying the other. I knew we weren't equals in circumstance. I was stable, grounded, and he was not. But I didn't see that as a flaw. I believed that with love and encouragement, a man who wanted to rise would eventually step into his manhood. The things I did, the dinner, the details, the way everything flowed, wasn't about flaunting. It was about exposure, about showing him a higher standard of life, what intention, stability, and care could look like. That's why I worked with a wedding planner, someone who made everything seamless and possible so the day could unfold with ease. What I understand now is that not every man wants to rise. Some want provision without responsibility, care without accountability. And if what he was truly looking for was someone to carry him, then he chose the wrong woman. Because I didn't marry to raise a man. I married believing I was choosing a partner. That belief was one of the last illusions of this marriage. In those days after the wedding, everything felt soft. I was still in Italy, still in our bubble, still moving in the afterglow of wedded bliss. We cooked together, we ate out, we shared meals, laughter, and the quiet intimacy of everyday life. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt broken. It was the kind of calm that makes you believe you finally arrived. Love felt easy, settled, and safe. Wrapped in the afterglow, I had no idea how fragile this moment really was. It was time to say goodbye again, but we knew I'd be back for my 6th trip. Around that time, we knew that change was on the horizon. He had mentioned the tension with his roommate in Napoli, and he mentioned the idea of moving out. He hinted about moving to Torino and being closer to the one son I knew about. It didn't feel alarming then. It felt like transition. As we walked through the airport, I believed what I had always believed, that this was just distance, not division. At the time, this was just another farewell. Ciao for now. When I returned home, it was back to reality. Daily communication and video calls, check-ins, the typical LDR normalcy that we had been doing for the last 2 years. On his end, he was doing just fine. Out shopping, getting new clothes, being well taken care of by me, his wife, having everything he needed, all his essentials, and more. I was back to work, traveling, and of course, enjoying good food while on the road. As always, I was keeping things moving. Meanwhile, on the home front, my daughter had started experimenting with new hairstyles and realized that she had an extraordinary new skill that would come in very handy. And then, 2 weeks later, my son had his first seizure. This came after months of finally stabilizing my daughter on medication after she had had 7 seizures. But it became something they bonded over, in addition to her taking interest in helping him take care of his hair and twist his hair. So now my focus had narrowed again, stabilizing my son, supporting my children, holding our home steady in the middle of all this uncertainty and health challenges. Life certainly felt busy, but everything was still intact. Around that time, my darling husband had been living his best life, taking good care of himself and planning his relocation back to Torino,
fully funded by me. There was more underlying that move than I understood then, and I'll share more about that with you soon. But this was the season I was in, back to reality. And at the same time, I had retained a lawyer, and we had officially initiated the sponsorship process. So we continued talking every day, checking in, sharing our daily lives across the miles, living inside the typical LDR marriage. There was rhythm, consistency, nothing felt alarming. Meanwhile, his life was changing. He was eating better, dressing better, living better. Even from a distance, my support continued. I helped him stabilize. I helped him improve his quality of life, and slowly I could see him starting to feel himself. He was more confident, more expressive, enjoying a lifestyle that had once been out of reach. And at the time, I saw this as growth, as progress, as the result of partnership and care. I was loving, I was trusting, I was believing in a future with the man I loved, my husband. By this point, he had already packed up and relocated to Torino. Torino is in the northern part of Italy, colder, more industrial, very different from Napoli, and it snowed there. But he had experienced that before. Remember, Torino was nothing new to him. That's where he was living when we first met. Remember his roommate, right? The one he didn't want to disturb, so he would talk to me on the stairwell each night. Remember that? By the time Torino entered the picture, nothing felt unusual. His explanation was simple. He explained it as practical. It was all about proximity, about being closer to the one son I knew about rebuilding a relationship that had been distant. That explanation made sense to me because I believed co-parenting didn't threaten marriage. I believed maturity looked like responsibility, not secrecy. So as he settled into his new life in Torino, I didn't question it or notice the similarities or the pattern, because patterns don't reveal themselves when you're living inside them. They reveal themselves when you step back and line everything up. What I didn't realize then was the pattern in his back and forth travel between Torino and Napoli. In 2019, those were just trips I took at face value. Visits he described as seeing his old roommate, handling something temporary, or simply moving between cities. At the time, I accepted those explanations without suspicion. I had no reason to believe otherwise. At the time, I didn't stop to wonder who was holding his phone when he sent videos of himself walking outside, who was behind the camera, who was present in those moments. At the time, I wasn't asking those questions. I wasn't ignoring red flags because at the time, I didn't see any. I simply wasn't shown the full picture yet. Years later, in 2025, when I finally laid out receipts, dates, transportation records, photos, and messages side by side, a different picture would emerge. It was part of a much longer story, one that would only make sense once the receipts were allowed to speak. But right now, immigration to Canada was our focus, and he was excited. I was back in Italy for my 6th trip, 1 year after we got married. But this time we were in Florence. It was both of our first times being there. A new city discovered slowly, one meal at a time. Those early evenings were about food and presence, finding a table, sharing plates, letting the day stretch out without rushing anywhere else. Florence has a way of inviting you to sit longer than planned, to order one more thing, to talk a little more, to linger. We tried places we'd never been, learned what we liked, returned to what felt familiar. Dinner after dinner, the city began to feel less like a destination and more like a rhythm. There was a comfort in that routine, walking to eat, eating to stay, staying because there was nowhere we needed to be next, except with each other. Those nights felt easy, unforced, like the pressure we'd been carrying for so long had finally loosened its grip. I remember the quiet intimacy of those meals, the way conversation flowed when there was no clock to race, the way laughter came more easily when the only plan was dessert. At that point, I believe this trip marked a shift from constant motion to shared time, from logistics to living. And in Florence, that belief felt real. These weren't grand gestures or carefully staged moments. They were ordinary, nourishing evenings, the kind you imagined building a life around. Looking back now, I understand why these nights mattered so much to me. They were real. They were grounding. They were honest, at least in how I was showing up. This is how trust settles in quietly, not through declarations, but through shared meals, familiar routes, and the comfort of routine. For those first nights in Florence, the food, The walks, the conversations, they made everything feel possible. And for that moment, that was enough. Nights like this felt easy. Walking home after dinner, Florence quieting down around us. Before this trip, I'd put aside enough money so we could stay in this little apartment for the month. Not a hotel, but a place to live. A place where we could cook, relax, snuggle, and just spend time together. I planned on working while we were there, sitting on the balcony, across time zones, logging in early, logging off late, doing whatever I needed to do so we could have this time together. Watching him walk ahead of me, dancing, relaxed, happy, I saw a man who looked healthier than the last time I'd seen him. He was eating well, very well. He gained weight too. And at the time, I saw this as a good thing, a sign of stability, of comfort, of life improving. But that's the thing about deception. It doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks exactly like this. What I didn't know then, what I would only discover years later, was that while I believed I was living one marriage, official documentation would later reflect another. While I believed there was one child, records would later show 2, possibly 3. And while I believed our future was being built together, other filings would tell a very different story, one that contradicted everything I understood our marriage to represent. But for now, coming home together like this, unlocking the door, walking through the apartment, flopping onto the couch, it felt normal, domestic, familiar. But while I believed our future was being built together, other filings would tell a very different story, one that contradicted everything I understood our marriage to represent. But here in August 2021, I didn't yet have those documents, and I didn't yet know what was being claimed. I was simply living the life I thought we were building, believing in one marriage, one future, one truth. And in moments like this, that's all I needed to feel real. We were starting to find our rhythm here in Florence. 3 quiet mornings, snuggling, cuddling, learning each other's habits in the small, ordinary ways that feel intimate only when love feels safe. I ask myself now, how is this not real? How could there be an underlying layer of deception beneath this all? How can someone you love so completely look you in the eyes in tender moments like this and know they're telling you lies? I remember comparing our hands and laughing at the contrast. I remember making him a big homemade Alfredo, rich and creamy, exactly the way he liked it. He had started eating a lot of pasta and was really enjoying it. It was beginning to feel so good watching him eat and give me that little nod of approval. I even took pride serving him in bed and giggling about how chubby his cheeks had gotten. Next on the menu was my curry chicken. Since I was raised by Caribbean parents from the beautiful islands of Trinidad and Tobago, where food is love and love is labor, I cooked the way I was taught to love. I knew I was nourishing him, body, mind, and spirit. I had upgraded this man's life in many ways, and it felt so good to watch him grow. So when he ate my curry chicken, he practically licked his plate clean. I guess the saying that the way to a man's heart is through his belly must be true. He would cook too, making his favorites like jollof rice, though once he made it way too spicy. And then there came his dancing. He could be such a silly rabbit sometimes, but as I sat on the couch fondly watching him, it was highly entertaining. I'd usually work during the day, sitting on the couch or sitting in the balcony,
logging in across time zones, doing what I needed to do. He'd rest or dance, scroll on his phone, maybe go to the market for me if we needed anything. Our fridge was always full. And of course, we always had plenty of wine. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt urgent. There was always something to do in the piazza. Lots of little stores, lots of people, and activities to there. If I took a break, I'd go on a walk with him. We'd just step out of our door, and right in front of us would be anything you could imagine. And then something else happened quietly, almost magically. While we were together in that small pocket of time, we received a notification from IRCC, which is the Canadian branch of immigration. And apparently the application that we had recently submitted or resubmitted, it had been accepted. That was a huge relief since there had been some problems with the prior submission. But our lawyer had handled it and now things were moving forward. No fanfare, no announcements, just a message in our portal while we were existing in grace, ease, and the flow of life. Between bites of caprese salad, pizza, and of course, gelato, it was like confirmation that what we were building was finally moving forward. It felt like a sign, like the universe was saying, yes, this is real. Keep going. We celebrated it softly in our way, believing that love, patience, and perseverance were finally aligning. And from where I stood, everything felt possible. There are moments that look simple on the surface, but carry so much meaning underneath. This was one of those moments. A pasta making class in Florence, flour on our hands, and laughter in a room full of strangers. Learning how to make something from scratch, slowly, intentionally. At the time, I thought this was just about pasta, about sharing an experience, about joy. But looking back now, I see something else too. I see intention. I watched him in that class, listening closely to the instructor, hands working the dough, laughing when he got it wrong, smiling when he got it right. I remember recording him quietly and feeling proud, not in a condescending way, but in the way you feel when you watch someone step into a version of themselves they've never had the chance to be before. He had lived in Italy for years, yet so much of Italy had been out of reach for him. Not because he didn't want it, but because his life there was constrained by survival, by status, by limitation. Until we walked together. In that room, he wasn't just the undocumented migrant. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't shrinking himself. He was just another student like everyone else, being taught, being respected, being included. I noticed how differently he carried himself when we were together. His head was higher, his energy lighter, his presence took up more space. Because this was never about an upgrade. Upgrades are external, surface level, focused on image, access, appearances, material things. What I cared about was his growth, his inner growth. I wasn't interested in polishing the outside of a man. I was interested in who he could become. I didn't see him as a project or a prize. I saw a seed, and I believed that with care, with love, with consistency, with stability and dignity, something solid would grow. I didn't need him to perform. When he made promises or tried to make promises, I would often smile and say, "It's okay, babe. Time will tell." And it surely did. I didn't need him to impress me or anyone. I wanted to see what would bloom when a man felt safe enough to rise on his own. I never asked him to be more than he was. I understood that we were in different places. I knew his capacity. When I needed someone to hold space for me, I didn't overwhelm him with what he couldn't carry. I knew his limits. So I went where my needs could be met. A friend, a therapist. That's love. That's wisdom. He would often try to search for the right words, but words, I would later learn, are easy when survival is the motivation. With him, I gave room. I gave him space to grow, time to become. I planted a seed, and I watered it patiently, and I waited, not anxiously, but with hope, to see what would grow. At the time, nothing felt wrong. What I didn't know then, and what I couldn't know then, was just how many versions of truth can exist at the same time, or how often love and intention are not enough when someone is living in survival. Florence felt like a city built to slow you down. Every street invited presence instead of rush. Every corner asked you to pay attention. That day, we paused in front of a sign pointing in different directions. One path toward the Medici, another toward the Duomo, others toward galleries, cathedrals, places shaped by art, faith, and legacy. I remember standing there, taking it all in, not just the city, but the moment, because I've always been someone who leads with connection. I feel my way through life. I listen for meaning beneath the surface. I care about how moments land, not just how they look. For me, Florence wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about being there together, sharing space, sharing silence, sharing wonder. We walked for hours, past stone buildings that had stood for centuries, through cathedrals built by people who believed what they were creating would outlive them. Florence has a way of reminding you that some things are meant to endure, that intention matters, that depth is built slowly, that connection is something people once structured their entire lives around. As we walked, I watched him. I watched how he moved through these spaces, how his curiosity opened, how his energy softened when the world expanded around him. One of the things I loved most about Italy, which is why I went back 6 times, was sharing experiences, not things, not appearances, but moments that invited presence. I've never been drawn to the surface of life. What matters to me is what happens underneath, the way people connect, the way meaning forms between two people when there's space to feel. There was something deeply human about watching him step into places that asked him to slow down, to look closer, to feel bigger than survival, to feel included. I noticed it in his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed, the way he carried himself differently when we walked side by side. In those moments, he wasn't defined by limitation. He was simply a man moving through history, through art and faith, connected to something larger than himself. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt performative. There were no questions pressing at the edges. It felt like we were building something quietly through shared steps, shared attention, shared presence. Looking back now, I understand how easy it is to mistake peace for permanence, how belief can settle gently when connection feels real. But in that moment, Florence held us exactly where we were. I remember this moment when he gave me flowers. And at the time, it felt special. It felt like proof, like maybe I was seen. Maybe I was valued. But looking back now, I realize how rare moments like this were. Flowers weren't the pattern. They were the exception most of the time. Because most of the time I was the one giving my time, giving my money, giving my energy, my presence, my love, across countries, across years, across sacrifices. I traveled, I supported, I invested, I believed. And what I got back was never equal to what I gave. I kept hoping it would change, that one day it would become mutual, that one day he would meet me where I was. But some people don't grow into reciprocity. They just grow comfortable receiving, and I had to accept I would never get back what I poured in. Here I was making memories, eating, laughing, and planning our anniversary tour to Cinque Terre, something special for us. Meanwhile, I had no idea that at the same time, a woman was preparing her testimony, a testimony claiming to be married to my husband, a testimony claiming he's the father of her children, a testimony describing a whole parallel life, a life I knew nothing about. And it wouldn't be until 2025 when I would hold that testimony in my hands. Sworn in Torino, Italy, August 25th, 2021 at 2:40 p.m. before the Ministry of the Interior. That day, another woman stood before the court authorities with 2 babies claiming she was his wife. And where was he? Oh, he was here in Florence, sitting across from me, sharing a meal, smiling for pictures, acting as if nothing else existed, while she carried the weight of that story alone. And while I was living in a marriage I believed was real. I think about that sometimes. How someone can live in 2 realities at once. How someone can let 2 women believe 2 completely different truths. And at the time, I was the only one who didn't know. Dancing through deception, performing happiness, all while a sworn testimony was being filed in Torino by a woman with 2 of his children claiming before the court to be his wife. I now understand his need for performance, his need to look happy when things aren't honest, his need to look stable when things are divided, his need to convince the world because he can't live his truth. He could dance here and disappear there. He could promise here and deny there. I didn't see it at the time because I was loving honestly. But this isn't a love story. It's a lesson. And I learned it the hard way. You don't know what you don't know. So while testimonies were being sworn in court by the mother of his children, we were on our way to Cinque Terre. I remember the bus ride, the winding roads, the first glimpse of the coastline, the way my heart started racing when I realized I was really here. I had dreamed about this place for years, and now I was seeing it with my husband. We were celebrating our 1-year wedding anniversary, and in my mind, it meant stability, commitment. It meant we were building something real. We already had immigration processes in motion in Canada and the US. We were planning, investing, and talking about the future. Or at least I was. In that moment, I wasn't suspicious, questioning, or looking for cracks. I was present, I was grateful, and I was excited to be sharing another new experience with him, another memory, another chapter. I remember standing there looking out at the water thinking, this is our life. This is what we're building. This is forever. Meanwhile, I was living in good faith, believing in my marriage, believing in my husband, believing in our future. And at the time, I had no reason not to. Cinque Terre was everything I imagined. The cliffs, the colors, the water. We took a boat tour and watched the coastline from the sea. We went down to the beach, sat by the water, let the sun sit on our skin. No rush, no agenda. It was one of those days where everything was slow and intentional. We weren't talking about problems. We weren't preparing or debating anything. We were just present, taking pictures, laughing, and for that day, it felt simple. It felt beautiful. It felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. He was sitting on the rocks looking out at the water, and I remember feeling proud. Proud in a quiet way, because he told me about his journey to Italy by sea, about the courage it took to cross water, about uncertainty, about risk, and standing with him there now, watching him look out at that same ocean, it fell full circle. The sea had once meant survival for him, and that day I wanted it to mean peace. I wanted him to see beauty where there had once been fear. I wanted him to feel accomplishment where there had once been instability. That's where my heart was. I was believing in his growth, and I was loving him from a place that was whole. And when I look back at that woman now, the woman I was, I don't see someone naive. I see someone sincere. I see someone who meant every intention and every word I said. I know the ocean can carry many things like fear, distance, risk, but it can also carry hope. And that day, I chose hope. Our day in Cinque Terre was coming to an end, and we both knew my trip was coming to an end too. Celebrating our first anniversary like this had been absolutely beautiful, and we were filled with so much hope for our future. We knew that the next time we saw each other, it wouldn't be a visit. The next time would be permanent. We had our paperwork in motion in 2 countries. We had plans and we had timelines. As we prepared to board our bus back to Florence, we were leaving with anticipation because we knew that when I left Italy this time, the distance between us would only be temporary. Our waiting had an expiration date. He knew he could rest easy on the ride back to our little apartment in Florence. I've always believed in seeing the good, in choosing hope, in looking at life through rose-colored glasses. And in September 2021, after returning home from Italy, it was back to reality, back to responsibility. Within weeks of my return, we received notification that our USCIS petition had been approved and was moving to the NVC stage, a huge milestone achieved in record time. With diligence and determination, I secured approval for our expedite request, and it was no small feat. But I can move mountains when I'm committed and consistent, and in my marriage, I always showed up as both.
Oh my God, this is the last day.
I don't have my face on.
It's okay. Man, I'm already missing you, baby.
Are you recording?
Yeah, listen. Like, seriously, I'm already missing you.
4 years later, 6 trips to Italy, countless flights across the Atlantic. My mind began to run through all the places we had been together since my very first trip to Italy in 2018. Torino, Milan, Venice, Lake Como, Amalfi Coast, Napoli, Rome, Pisa, Tuscany, Florence, and let's not forget Paris, Nice, and Monaco. We had been so many places together. And now, here we were in September 2021, and his CR1 visa had finally been approved. He had to go for the interview at the U.S. consulate in Napoli. I arranged his travel from Torino to Napoli for his medical exam and the interview. I arranged for his train tickets and overnight accommodations. We talked at length about what life in America would look like, how the transition would unfold, and what our future together would look like once we were no longer separated by distance. This wasn't a vacation. This was permanent now. I spent hours preparing a folder of documents for him and shipped it so he would have everything he needed in his hands in time for his interview in March. I waited anxiously by the phone for his call. I thought about all we had been through to finally get to this point. And then my phone rang. I picked it up and held it gently to my ear. I took a deep breath and I heard him say, "Babe, I'm approved." Those words were like music to my ears. After all the distance, all the documents, all the coordination, all the belief, the next flight I booked would not be for me to go to Italy, but for him to come to America. After 4 years of distance, after paperwork and approvals, after time zones and airport goodbyes, the distance was finally over. For the first time, there was no ocean between us. I wish I could say this would be the happily ever after I'd been waiting for. I wish I knew then what I know now. Because sometimes when distance disappears, so does the illusion. Here in the land of opportunity, some things only reveal themselves when there's nowhere left to hide. And that's when everything begins to change. When he first arrived in America, everything was already in motion. We spent the first few days in New York City sightseeing, and then I had a planned work trip to North Carolina. Before he even got here, I had arranged a job for him. The husband of my dear friend and coworker owned a renovation company and agreed to hire him as soon as he got here. The plan was for him to stay there for a bit, work, and get settled until we figured out our next step. We even went to get his social security number. And after I got him settled, I left North Carolina feeling good. He was happy, he was documented, and he could finally start working and making his own money while living his American dream. But during that first week, something didn't sit right with me. His first Facebook post in America was a picture of him holding my passport. He captioned it, "Blue Passport, get Y," and tagged North Carolina. When I brought it up to him a few days later, he said I was nagging and told my friend I was making something out of nothing. Then he blocked me. Looking back, that first week in America told me more than I wanted to admit.
United States of America, New York, chilling. Man. Oof, I'm so happy, man. I'm so happy to be in this ground, this New York. No, I'm so happy. 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 This is Times Square. Life in Times Square. Please. I miss you guys in Italy, but sorry, I'm not coming back. I'm not coming back to Italy. Bye. Bye.
After that first week, blocking became his pattern whenever we disagreed, and our next real argument happened not long after. See, North Carolina was always supposed to be temporary. He was now here on a CR1 visa, and his green card was for 2 years. We still had our paperwork processing for Canada, and he had a lot of options. The plan was for him to work, save some money, and then move closer to me, closer to the Canadian border. Since I was traveling to the US for work anyway, I knew that it would be easier for us if he was closer. But he said he loved living in North Carolina. He was staying with my friend and her husband in Cary, but he started talking about wanting to get a job and move to Charlotte. At the time, I didn't understand why distance was suddenly okay. I mean, I thought we were supposed to be building a life together. So he came to visit me. He met my family in person for the first time. My parents, my sister, my cousin, my kids, my friends, they were all skeptical. But because they loved me, they kept their side-eyeing to a minimum. But I didn't want to keep doing this visiting thing. I thought we were moving toward being in the same place. We argued about it, and like before, he blocked me again. Then later, he apologized. And after that apology, he posted a picture of us on one of his Facebook accounts. And at the time, I thought the apology meant progress, but it was a pattern that would only get worse. When he came to visit me for our second wedding anniversary, I was still in the middle of integrating him into my life, slowly and carefully. We had plans to visit my friend for her birthday party, and she lived a few hours away, so it was a little road trip for us. He loved dancing and drinking his beer in my car while I was driving. Even little things mattered, like the fact that he didn't have his driver's license yet. So I was the one driving him around. We knew that he'd need to get his driver's license as soon as possible once he moved closer, since I wouldn't be around to drive him to work and back or to get groceries. He had no problem cooking for himself or being self-sufficient now that everything had been lined up for him, and I was proud of him. And while he was here visiting, he spent time with my family. He spent time with my kids. He was working out with my son, and we were doing real life things, not just the highlight moments. He used to tell me he felt like my parents didn't really like him, and to be honest, they didn't. Everyone saw through him except for me. But they welcomed him and allowed me to live in my little bubble. They were side-eyeing him real hard, but they never showed it. My mom would give him that Trini eye roll anytime he talked. There was no point trying to hide her facial expressions. If you know my mom, you know what I'm talking about. She don't play. My dad was a little more subtle. He's really close with my ex-husband, so he would make small jabs and refer to my ex-husband as my husband, or he'd incorrectly say my husband's name. And to be honest, I don't think my dad knows how to pronounce his name to this day. But honestly, my family wasn't trying to be harsh. They were just watching. They wanted to see how everything would unfold, and I understood that. So I took my time. I wasn't rushing anyone. I wanted my family to see what I was seeing, what I believed I was seeing. Around that time, we were talking about the future and about closing the distance. North Carolina had always been temporary, but we had already argued about it, and eventually he agreed, and he said he would move closer. So this visit felt like a fresh start. We celebrated our anniversary together, and it wasn't just the two of us. A close friend of mine came from Boston, someone I went to university with, and she came with her family. So we all met up, we all hung out at Canada's Wonderland. It was one of those weekends that looked simple, but it actually meant a lot to me. It was his first time at an amusement park, and he wanted to go on all the rides. He was excited like a kid himself. I do remember him being on his phone a lot, and instead he was sending pics to his son, the one son I knew about at the time. And at this point, I knew he had reconnected with his son and the mother of that child, and that made me happy. In this moment, I was very happy. I genuinely wanted him to have new experiences. I wanted him to feel like he was stepping into a bigger life, and I believed we were moving forward together. And in those moments with my kids around, my family, celebrating, planning, I felt like I was doing it right, like I was building something real, on purpose. I didn't know then that just a few days later, with his obsessive interaction with his phone, that I would see something on his phone that would change the way I understood all of it. Before I tell you what I found on his phone, you need to understand what I was building at the time. He had been working in North Carolina. That was always temporary. When he agreed to move closer, we started putting real plans into motion. I created his resume. I coached him through his interviews. He transitioned from his old job to starting a new one closer to me. Because he didn't have credit yet, the first place he found had a roommate. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I added him as a user on my credit card so he could begin building his own credit. I didn't want my failures to color his world. I wanted him to build himself up from the ground up. I was teaching him how credit works. I was teaching him things nobody told me. I was telling him. I even made sure our taxes were not filed together because I didn't want my mistakes to fall on him. This is how independence works. He didn't have his driver's license yet, so I made sure he had transportation. I got him a scooter so he could go back and forth to work. From the outside, everything looked like progress, a new job, a new place, a new routine. I wasn't trying to carry him. I was trying to equip him. And that's why when I found what I found on his phone, it hit me hard. It hit me the way it did. And I'm still recovering from that discovery. After he moved closer and started working, we fell into a rhythm, a routine. He had settled into his new job, was making his own money, paying his own rent, paying his own bills, including his half of our joint cell phone bill. He was getting to know his surroundings. I helped him find a barber and a stylist for his hair. He still wasn't driving yet, but we did things locally. It was about a 90-minute drive from where I lived across the border, so we would take turns. He'd come over to see me, but most of the time I'd go to him. When the weather was nice, we went to local events. We walked around, tried food, listened to music. It felt easy. These were the little things that make someone feel settled when they're starting over. It felt steady. It felt normal. In those early days, I had helped him settle into his apartment. He had absolutely nothing, so we had to start from scratch in order to furnish his room. We got a brand new bed, side tables, an air conditioner, and a set of table and chairs for the dining area and the kitchen. Fortunately, he had a roommate, so there was already a couch there, though we hardly spent any time out there. Since he enjoyed cooking his Nigerian food and eating, we looked around for an African market so he could get the specific ingredients and groceries he needed. When I'd go over to see him, I even got into the habit of bringing him the specialty items that he could not find over there, especially since he was not driving yet. He would take me out sometimes, and now he would offer to pay for me. It felt like progress, like we were finding our footing. One night he took me out to dinner, and while we were sitting there, he was on his phone a lot. I was used to him being on the phone. That wasn't new, but this felt different. At one point, I glanced over and I saw a message coming through that said, "Good night." It was from the mother of his children, and I remember thinking, why does she need to say good night to you? I have children too, and I don't make it a habit of saying good night to their father. So I said something to him about it, and that's when he got upset. He said, "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" We went back to the apartment that night, and I knew the next day I was going to look through that phone for myself. The next morning, as he was asleep, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. I went through his phone. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't emotional. I just needed clarity. I opened their messages on WhatsApp. And now, keep in mind, by this point, I knew who she was, and I believed that she knew who I was, but maybe she didn't. I have no idea what he had told her about me, but I do know that when he first arrived, he handed me the phone so we could say hello to each other. To me, they were just in a co-parenting relationship like the one I had with my ex. So this wasn't about discovering her existence. It was about discovering the tone of their messages. And what I saw in that phone didn't look like co-parenting to me. It wasn't just logistics, and it wasn't just about the one child I knew about. There was intimacy, terms of endearment, conversations that didn't match the story I had been told. And in that moment, I realized something very simple. I wasn't looking at confusion. I was looking at overlap. So I picked up the phone and I called her. I just needed to understand what I was seeing, and I wanted to hear it from her first. We spoke for a bit, and she was surprised to hear my voice on the other end of his phone. She was polite but guarded, and I really didn't learn much from that conversation. When he eventually woke up, he came out of the room, and he asked me if I knew what I had done. I looked at him blankly, because at that point, he didn't know what I had actually seen on his phone. He just knew I had called her. And that's when he said he was going to tell me everything. He said he didn't know where she was at first, and that when he found her again, she had already had the second child. He said he was sorry he never told me the truth, and he said he wanted to tell me, but he was afraid to tell me from a distance. At this point, I was only inquiring about the tone of their messages. I had no idea that he would drop a bombshell on me. That's when he told me that they had 2 boys together, not just one. And I remember feeling something drop in my stomach. Not anger, not even tears at first, just shock. The kind of shock where your body knows something before your mind catches up. The only other time in my life I remember feeling this exact sensation was when I found out at 18 that I had been adopted as a baby. Not because these situations were the same, but because that moment when you realize the story you were living wasn't the full story, it hits your body first, and your body remembers. Because in that moment, I realized the life I thought I understood was not the one I was living. After he told me about the second child, I was devastated, rocked to my core, thinking about how he could have possibly kept this hidden from me for all these years. I'd been to Italy so many times. How is it possible that he couldn't have sat me down on one of those trips to tell me the truth? He told me to take as much time as I needed. And if I'm being honest, I started trying to numb the edges of my pain. One more glass of wine at night, just to quiet my mind long enough to sleep. And life didn't stop. I was still driving back and forth across the border for work and to see him sometimes, processing, thinking. It took me about a month of conversations, a month of apologies, a month of him begging. His mother called me. We cried together. We prayed together. His sister called. Everyone was asking me to forgive him. He told me there was no romantic relationship between him and the mother of his children. He told me that if I looked closer at the messages, I would see that it was one-sided, that they were just co-parenting like me and my ex. And in between those border crossings, I kept doing the math. The child was born in July of 2019, and my first trip to Italy was October of 2018. So from a timeline perspective, he said she was already pregnant, so the math was mathing. That didn't erase the concealment, but it did complicate my anger. So after about a month, I made a decision. I decided to forgive him, and I opened my heart to welcome his second son in the same way that I had welcomed the first one. I had forgiven him. And forgiveness feels powerful in the moment. It feels mature. It feels evolved. It feels like love winning. But forgiveness is not the same thing as healing. By now, we had resumed spending time together. Slowly, carefully. Or at least I thought it was carefully. Date nights. Me learning how to cook some of his favorite Nigerian foods. Things were still fresh. The deceit was still fresh. The images were still fresh in my mind. The ache was still fresh. But I told myself, if I forgave him, I had to move forward. And so I did. Fall was here and it was starting to get colder. He had gotten his driver's permit and had started taking driving lessons. So the next big moment was him getting a car. And I need to say this clearly because clarity matters. Since arriving in America, this man had become fully self-sufficient, like he was supposed to be in the first place when I met him in Italy, but he wasn't. So when we went to look for cars and he found what he wanted, he was the one that put down every cent of the down payment and continued to pay for it in the years ahead. Every dollar, every payment, every month. I had nothing to do with the financing. The only thing I did was co-sign because he hadn't established credit yet. I remember us sitting at the bank. He withdrew the money from his account and he was proud and I was proud of him. At least I wanted to be proud. But while we were sitting there, his phone kept pinging. Every text that came in, I could hear ping, ping, and my body reacted before my mind did. It felt like PTSD, like my nervous system didn't believe the forgiveness my mouth had spoken. I could feel the anxiety rising in my stomach. I told him how I was feeling, gently, not accusing, just honest. But he became irritated and asked me why I was trying to ruin this moment of him about to purchase his first car. Like my insecurity was the problem, like my trauma was inconvenient. And that's when I started to realize something. You can forgive someone and still not feel safe. Looking back now, I wonder if I moved too quickly. I wonder if I tried to rebuild without fully processing what had been broken. I wanted the future so badly that I skipped over the healing. I had co-signed a car, but I hadn't co-signed peace yet. The paperwork was clean, but my nervous system certainly was not. Forgiveness opened the door, but trust was still outside. I said I had forgiven him, and forgiveness felt powerful. It felt like growth. It felt like maturity. It felt like love choosing grace. But forgiveness is not the same thing as safety. And that's what I didn't understand yet. Because while I had forgiven him, I didn't feel safe anymore. And that was new. Before everything unraveled, I had felt secure in our marriage. I felt steady. I felt grounded in us. But after the betrayal and deception, something shifted. It was subtle at first, not loud, not dramatic, just this quiet instability, like the ground underneath me wasn't solid anymore. And that's when I decided I needed to talk to someone. Through my job, I had benefits. So I reached out to a therapist, not because I wanted to attack him, not because I wanted to leave, but because my nervous system was dysregulated. My body was reacting in ways that my mind couldn't override. Whenever I was around him, my chest would tighten, my heart would race, my stomach would drop, especially when his phone would go off or when I'd see him constantly texting. And I asked him if he would join me in therapy, not to blame, not to accuse, but to rebuild properly. But he refused. And instead, he would say, I told you to take your time to heal. If you can't be here, you don't have to come visit me. I don't need your trouble. I don't need you disturbing my peace. And those statements began to stay with me because I wasn't trying to leave. I was trying to feel safe. And there's a difference. Safety isn't about whether someone is physically present. Safety is about whether your nervous system can relax in their presence, and mine couldn't anymore. When his phone would ring or ping, my body would brace. He eventually started turning the ringer off when I was around. But even in silence, I could still see it. The constant messaging. And I didn't want to become that insecure wife. I didn't want to be a burden, so I internalized it. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself forgiveness meant pushing through discomfort. But forgiveness without safety or reassurance is fragile. It's like standing inside a building that looks intact, but you know something in the foundation shifted. That's what it felt like. We had just gotten the car, and he was making his payments. He was on my insurance, paying his half, but he didn't have his full license yet. So he was really only supposed to drive it to and from work. But I would lie awake at night thinking, what if something happens? What if I'm not there? Because my travel schedule was busy again and I had 2 medical sites in upstate New York. So I was juggling, and he was making his payments. He was on my insurance, paying his half, but he didn't have his full license yet. So he was really only supposed to drive it to and from work. But I would lie awake at night thinking, what if something happens? What if I'm not there? Because my travel schedule was busy again and I had 2 medical sites in upstate New York. So I was juggling everything: work, marriage, kids, therapy, trying to rebuild, trying not to look fragile. Sometimes I would see him on my way to a site or on my way back. But our time together felt compressed, like we were squeezing a marriage into travel windows. And the whole time, there was this quiet unease, not chaos, not screaming, just instability. As Christmas began to draw near, it would be his first Christmas as a green card holder. And he told me that he wanted to go back to Italy to see his kids. It was easier knowing that I would be in Trinidad with my family for a wedding, so I respected that. I supported that. He had saved up enough for his own ticket, and I had nothing to do with purchasing it. But he did need my help with the visa process. And so we gathered documents. I drove with him to New York City in the car, the new car, the one he was paying for. And that drive felt symbolic because I was helping him prepare to leave the country while I was quietly trying to rebuild safety in myself. It softened it, but there was still a quiet thought. It would have been nice to spend this Christmas together, to build something new instead of revisiting something old. But I didn't say that because I didn't want to seem insecure and I didn't want to compete with his children, so I swallowed it. And I told myself love means support. But here's what I understand now. Forgiveness rebuilds the walls, but safety rebuilds the foundation. And if that foundation is cracked, the structure may stand for a while, but it won't feel steady. I remember years ago when we got married and I walked through the Roman ruins in Italy. I remember being struck by how something so grand, so powerful, and so permanent could collapse. Not all at once, but slowly, stone by stone. And that's actually what 2023 would eventually become for us. But at this point, I didn't know the crumble was beginning. I just knew I didn't feel steady anymore. I had forgiven him, but I didn't feel safe. And that. Christmas came and went, and a few days later, I left for the beautiful islands of Trinidad and Tobago with my family. It had been years since I'd been back, and this would be the first time taking my children there with me. We were all excited. My parents, my sister, my kids. The only person missing from this trip was my husband. And the reason he was missing? Well, he had his visa and his flight ticket for his first trip back to Italy. He had left Italy almost 8 months earlier, and although he spoke with his children regularly, he had been adamant about saving enough money to see them over the holidays. At this time, we were still living apart, about 90 minutes away from each other across the border, while his Canadian paperwork was processing. He was working full-time, and he took pride in being financially independent, self-sufficient, paying his own bills, and standing on his own 2 feet, and I respected that. In Italy, he had been struggling, but now he was rebuilding. Meanwhile, there had been record snowfall where he lived, and from the sound of things, he wasn't even sure his flight would make it off the ground. We stayed in regular communication during my trip, but something had begun to shift. Subtle, a sense of detachment, not dramatic, just different. But in the meantime, Trinidad was beautiful. Laughter, music, warmth, sunshine. From the outside, everything looked joyful. But in the background, there was tension. Because while I was ringing in the new year with my family, my husband was preparing to leave for Italy. And I'm not going to lie. From the first time he brought up the trip, I felt a deep dread I couldn't explain. Logically, it made sense. I was going to be away anyway, and I could never interfere with a father wanting to see his children. That wasn't the issue. What unsettled me was what had happened before. The messages I had found, the way the situation with the mother of his children had been handled by him. He seemed to think that confessing about his second son had resolved everything. But for me, it created more questions than answers. I never felt fully satisfied with her explanation for calling him her darling husband. I mean, if they weren't married, why that language? And his explanation that it was one-sided, that he was just appeasing her to keep the peace, it didn't sit right. Not because I wanted drama, but because it felt unresolved. And unresolved things don't create safety. Still, he had his ticket, he had his visa, and he was ready to go. And then I got the news. His flight was canceled due to the snow. I remember feeling two things at the same time. On the surface, I was supportive, disappointed for him, but deep down, I was relieved. Relieved in a way I didn't want to admit, because something in me had been uneasy about that trip. He was telling me one thing, but my body was telling me something else. And when the flight didn't happen, it felt like the universe pressed pause. And I didn't know whether that pause was protection or postponement. So when I returned from Trinidad, something felt different between us. Not explosive, but just distant. Our conversations became shorter, less layered, more surface. And I told myself, maybe it was the holidays. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was nothing. But eventually, I decided to take a closer look at our joint phone records. Now, I'm going to be honest. Maybe I was looking because something in me felt unsettled. And when your nervous system has been dysregulated long enough, you start looking for data. And what I found were long phone calls to a local number, longer than my calls with him, sometimes hours. They were repeated and consistent. And this time, I stayed calm. I told myself, let's not ring any alarms yet. Let's wait for the February bill, because I didn't want to be wrong, and I didn't want to accuse prematurely. I didn't want to destroy what I thought we were still rebuilding. So I sat with it. And that silence, it was heavy. So when the February bill came, it was more of the same. So I gathered my receipts and I asked him calmly, babe, whose number is this? Now, if I told you what happened next, you might not believe me. But long story short, my question was never answered. Instead of reassurance, he flipped. He demanded that we separate our phone bills immediately. And that reaction told me more than the records ever could. Because if there was nothing to hide, why rush to remove transparency? Then the narrative shifted. I became the problem, the nagging wife, the one disturbing his peace. He even quoted Proverbs 21:19 about it being better to live in the desert than with a contentious spouse. And in that moment, something cracked. Because when concern is reframed as contention, safety disappears. And that's when the Roman ruins came back to me. Remember those ruins in the backdrop of our wedding photos? Empires don't collapse overnight. They erode quietly. Hairline fractures first, then structural weakness. And once you see the crack, you can't unsee it. So by the time my birthday rolled around in early March, things were tense. But I had a site visit at a medical center near him, and we decided I would stay a few days after work so we could talk. We agreed to keep the peace for my birthday, and he bought me a cake. We went out dancing, smiles, photos, fun. From the outside, it looked normal. It looked loving. It looked steady. But I remember laughing on the dance floor thinking something is off, and I just wanted to enjoy my birthday because by then I already had the number. I had already put it into WhatsApp, and when her profile pic popped up, she was a beautiful African American girl, very pretty. So when I messaged her and told her who I was, she was shocked. She said she had no idea he was married, but she was willing to talk. She was a busy nurse, so we scheduled a time to speak the next day. But for now, the night was young. We were out dancing, smiling, celebrating. But I knew that once I made that call, it would be the beginning of the real crumble. This was the first birthday I had spent with my husband. It was March 4th, 2023, and I had just turned 49. In years past, I had always spent my birthday with my kids and my family. I have a huge family, and I've always been surrounded by endless love and support. But this year, I decided to spend it with my husband, just the two of us, despite the fact that we were in the midst of a storm. We agreed to put our problems aside for one night so we could celebrate my birthday together. And we did just that. But now it was the next day, and it was time to face reality. I woke up and quietly crawled out of bed. I had a lot planned for my day, and I knew that despite our celebrations last night, today definitely was not going to end well. I had a phone call scheduled with the mystery woman who my husband had been spending hours with on the phone over the last few months. I left the bedroom quietly and went out to the dining area of the apartment so I could pull out my laptop and get some work done. He was used to sleeping late since his body had already adjusted to working the night shift at his job. The day passed slowly, and I knew I'd planned to leave and head back to Canada around 6 p.m., which would be the same time when he'd be leaving for work. I continued waiting patiently, and then my phone rang in the late afternoon. It was her. We exchanged some polite pleasantries as I sipped on my glass of wine. We talked for almost 90 minutes. She was a lovely girl, and I learned a lot from our conversation. She confirmed that she didn't know he was married. She shared how long they had been talking, but didn't confirm exactly how they had met. But she didn't have to, because I already knew. I had seen the notifications popping up on his phone from an online dating site. As a matter of fact, I had even found his profile on that site. Name, age, location, except he was using his brother's profile picture instead of his own. I would tell you the name of the website, but it's too lewd for me to even share here. He would later tell me that he set up this profile for his brother. She told me how often they had met and how consistently they had spoken. I already knew the consistency of their conversations because I had verified everything on our phone bills. And as she spoke, the puzzle pieces began to lock into place. The long phone calls, the detachment, the urgency for us to separate our phone bills. It wasn't insecurity. It was evidence. After we exchanged timelines, she told me they had met in person more than once, at least on 3 occasions. And I remember my body going still. Because up until that moment, part of me had hoped It was just an emotional connection, a friend. But this was physical meetings, in person, intentional. I asked her if there was any physical intimacy between them, and she quietly said no. She also told me that she had lent him money and that he was paying her back in installments. That detail hit differently, not because of the amount she lent him, but because of the secrecy around it. He would later tell me that he only borrowed it from her so that he wouldn't have to ask me, because we were still building, still trying to repair, and he was trying to establish financial independence from me and transparency. Yet, here was another financial thread running parallel to ours. I didn't accuse, I didn't scream, I just continued asking questions, and I listened. She sounded hurt, disappointed, confused. She told me that she truly believed he was single, that he lived alone, and that he was building something new by himself. And in that moment, I realized we weren't just dealing with distance, him and I. We were dealing with duplication, two narratives, two realities. When that call ended an hour and 30 minutes later, I felt calm, not hysterical, not screaming, just clear. Clear in a way that only truth can make you. So I decided to confront him, not aggressively, not theatrically. I simply said, I spoke to her, and then I said her name. Instead of answering, instead of addressing what I presented before him, he told me that it was time for me to leave and that I should pack my things and go home. He then said that this is why he doesn't like having me over, because I like too much drama and I disturb his peace. He then said that here I am bringing this up right before he has to go to work, and I should know he needs his rest because I'm stressing his life. In that moment, I was trying my best to stay calm, but I could feel the rage rising up inside of me. And then as he continued hurling insults about my character as a nagging wife, he then pulled out his phone and began recording me. In that moment, something shifted, because until then, I wasn't yelling. I wasn't being violent. I was asking questions, looking for answers. And instead of dialogue, here he was recording me at the height of my emotional anguish. Instead of accountability, there was a camera. And I remember feeling so disoriented. Because when someone records you instead of responding to you, it changes the dynamic. It turns a conversation into a performance. It shifts the focus from resolution to defense. And here's something I've learned since then. When a person is confronted with truth, sometimes they don't respond with clarity. They respond with control. And what happens next can look messy. Because when you feel betrayed, when you feel dismissed, when you feel unheard, your nervous system reacts like mine did. And that reaction can later be used as the headline, not the cause, but the reaction. There's a term people use now. It's called reactive abuse. It's when someone is pushed emotionally, denied clarity, and destabilized. And then when they finally react, that reaction becomes the story instead of what led up to it.